Hi, this is Dr. Lynn Fitzgibbons. I'm here to give a SARS-CoV-2 update to the first responders of Santa Barbara County. It's late December 2020 and a lot to talk about, particularly with vaccines. You do this every single day. You rush to motor vehicle accidents, to fires, to mudslides, but this year has been very different in many ways. The risk to each of our incredible first responders this year has been more subtle, but also more consistent. In many ways, the threat has not left for months. And so I sincerely wish to start by simply acknowledging every single one of our first responders for all that you have done over these very difficult months. Each of you stand on our front lines. You live with the possibility of unknown exposures when responding. And all this while juggling the psychological, sometimes emotional impact of not knowing if you've come in contact with or perhaps even have caught the virus after a call. And all that while perhaps wondering and worrying about the loved ones in your lives and the risk of bringing this virus home. Let me say it again and very clearly. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's talk about the landscape of COVID-19 right now in our county. You've all lived it, and you've all followed this epidemic. In this graph, we see back in March, the beginning of the epidemic in Santa Barbara County. On the y-axis here, you see the number of cases reported to the Public Health Department every day. And so everyone remembers what happened over the summer with a big surge, a few big days in our community over the summer. Of course, the very big spike back in May related to the Federal Corrections Complex in Lompoc. But our community, of course, surged over the summer, and then things quietened down. And as you all know, unfortunately, right now, we are setting record after record with regards to new viruses in our community. When we look specifically at this last month or so, as you all know, we have more COVID-19 in Santa Barbara County than we have really ever had before. In fact, we have over 1,500 new cases diagnosed in the last 7 days. The types of records that we really just haven't seen so far through the epidemic. So what's the good news? The good news is the vaccine is here. Let's talk a little bit about it though, because understandably, we all have a lot of questions about what this vaccine really means and what it really is. The vaccine is what is called an mRNA vaccine. And what this means is the vaccine is basically a very small injection of a piece of mRNA that encodes what's called the spike protein, perhaps the most important protein on the outside of the virus. And when I say it's mRNA, what I mean is it's basically the recipe or the code, the directions for a cell to make that protein. It's not the directions to make a whole virus. And so you can't catch COVID-19 from the mRNA vaccine. But rather, what happens is you get an injection with this tiny amount of mRNA that's encoded in a lipid coating, and it gets injected into your own cells. And in your own cells, it never enters the nucleus, it never comes in contact with your own DNA, but out in the outside of the cells where proteins are made, your ribosomes, your protein factories, they read this mRNA and they make that spike protein. There are a couple of modifications from the usual spike protein, but it's very, very similar to the virus's own spike protein. And then what happens is the spike protein moves around the body, and your own antibodies, your own immune cells, they start to recognize this spike protein as foreign. And so you mount an immune response, and you learn basically how to deal with this spike protein if your body, your immune system, ever comes in contact with that protein again, perhaps on a call in 6 weeks' time. So what did the New England Journal of Medicine article show us with regards to this vaccine? They gave the vaccine to tens of thousands of patients who were then followed to see whether or not they developed COVID-19. They also gave just as many shots, injections of saltwater saline, placebo, to an equally large group of people. And they basically followed those two groups out to see if there was a difference in the likelihood that they would develop symptomatic COVID-19. And so here is the results of the study, perhaps the most important study that's been released so far. You see here in red, the group that received the vaccine, and in blue, the group that received the placebo. There were about 18,000 included in this analysis, and 18,000 received placebo. And when we go down here, 21,000 and about 21,000. And what you see here is a huge difference, Out of 18,000, only 8 who received the vaccine developed COVID. And out of, again, about 18,000, 162 who received the placebo developed COVID. And so that difference is very, very substantial. Similarly, the severe COVID group included only 1 of the vaccine recipients, but 9 with severe hospital need requiring or oxygen requiring COVID in those who received the placebo and were not protected. And so it's really this chart that gives us this number that we've heard thrown around of 95% efficacy or effectiveness. And then what about safety? Because this is perhaps the most important information. This is the question that I've really been asking for months, and I think many of you have too. The vaccine recipients did have local reactions. They had pain, redness, and swelling, as well as some systemic reactions, fevers, headache, muscle aches. And they had more of those than those who received the placebo, which gave them no protection, of course. The reactions were a little bit stronger the second time around, so it makes sense. After the immune system learns what the spike protein is, and it gets another dose a few weeks later, 3 or 4 weeks later, depending on which vaccine, those reactions were more significant, not substantially more significant, but they were more significant. And the vast majority of the side effects that were reported and studied very carefully and followed very closely were mild or moderate and got better quickly. And again, we've talked about what's called efficacy, but again, this was studied formally about a week after the second dose, and it was shown to be 95% effective. So all this very good news straight from the New England Journal article. A couple of other really important points about safety, however. Remember that mRNA vaccines can't give you COVID. Absolutely, you can have some of those side effects, and they can behave a little bit like your body would behave if you had COVID, but that's of course because your body's doing to the spike protein what it would do to the whole virus if the whole virus was there and actually causing illness. I think another important thing to remember, they don't affect or interact with our own DNA in any way. So it doesn't go into the nucleus of the cell, which is where our DNA is, our genetic material. And after the mRNA has been read for perhaps several days, then that mRNA basically gets broken down and the cell recycles those nucleic acids and moves on. And so that mRNA should not persist in someone's body long after they receive the vaccine. And then what about a little bit more of the benefit information or the efficacy information? And this is perhaps my favorite chart when we're talking about the vaccine. Here we see from day 0, when someone received the vaccine, all the way out to 112 days. And on this y-axis, they're showing us what % of people developed COVID. Out of the people who received placebo, which is blue, and it makes sense. These people lived in our world with this pandemic, and they had no protection from the vaccine, and so they were given placebo, and as you would expect, over time, they just developed more and more and more and more COVID. But look at what happened to the vaccine group. For that first 12 days or so, the vaccine group was still vulnerable to catching COVID. But then something kicked in. The immune system kicked in. It recognized the spike protein. And suddenly that protection was turned on. And so here you see where the red line leaves the blue line. And suddenly this group essentially stops getting new COVID infections. If we want to drill down to actually what happened in those first 3 weeks, we can see the enlarged area up here. And what we really see again is that it was day 12 approximately where that protection really seemed to kick in, and the red line really starts to protect and be protected, and the blue line continues to get more infection. All good news, I think, with regards to how well this vaccine seems to work. So what have been some of the FAQs? Very important question is how effective are these vaccines in protecting against COVID? And as we've just seen, of course, these vaccines are very effective very quickly after even the first dose. And of course, 94 to 95% protection after the second dose. Second question, how will we know that immunity is maintained? Will titers be necessary? So what we know is that immunity lasts for at least those few months that the studies have been going on. There's no indication that it seems to drop off quickly, and it's likely that with a second dose, we have more durability of the protection or of the immunity. Durability in vaccine lingo essentially means how long the immunity or the protection will last. And so the idea is we're clearly seeing after just that first dose a lot of protection, and that second dose is very likely reminding the immune system about the spike protein so that that protection is going to be longer lasting. Titers are not being done at this point or recommended. And it's really unknown whether the virus will stay very similar to its current form right now, or whether, as we've seen with influenza, for example, over years, or perhaps even sooner, we may see a little bit of shift of the virus. We're already hearing about different mutant strains, of course, that continue to occur. And following those very closely, but it's always possible that down the road at some point, the virus could change slightly such that the vaccine would have to change slightly to keep up. At this point, there's no indication that that's the case or that that's necessary now, but just something to keep in mind for the future. And what about contraindications? So remember that anyone with a severe or anaphylactic reaction to any of the vaccine components should not receive the vaccine. Specifically, people who have previously had allergic reactions to some of the lipid components. And if you are one of those people, definitely talk to your doctor. It's recommended that pregnant women and immunocompromised patients do discuss with their doctors. But the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists came out with a statement last week that this vaccine must be offered to pregnant and lactating women. And finally, the recommendation is that lactating women can certainly receive the vaccine. So if you had COVID-19, should you get vaccinated? Do you need to get vaccinated? There's not enough information currently available to say how long your protection from your actual infection lasts. We know that we've seen a small number of reinfection after a few months where someone had an infection, they got better, they had negative tests, and then unfortunately they fell ill again and were not protected and did fall ill and get another new infection with a new version essentially of the virus. We do know from the studies that that natural protection or immunity probably doesn't last very long, but it at least likely lasts for months. More studies are being done to better understand this. It's also not known, of course, how long immunity will last after the vaccine. We've already talked about that second dose as adding that durability with the idea that that should extend the protection. But of course, we simply need more time to know how long that really is. At this point, it is recommended that someone who had COVID-19 can be vaccinated once they feel better, once their acute illness is over. Some people may choose to wait 90 days before receiving the vaccine, knowing that they are relatively protected for up to those first 90 days. But that's not necessary if a person chooses to get vaccinated sooner. Will I still need to wear an N95 mask? Can I use a surgical mask? As we've mentioned, there are still so many unknowns about the vaccine, including whether it will protect against someone becoming infected, even if they don't show symptoms, which we call asymptomatic infection, because that person could, of course, possibly transmit it to others. The study, remember, is only looking and only followed well people who developed symptomatic or symptoms of COVID-19. We don't yet fully know whether even after getting protection against developing symptoms, you could potentially still become infected without symptoms and then pass it on to others. And so at this point, clearly, until more is known, the vaccine is a very important layer of protection, but we should not change any of our current masks or distancing practices. Are there any known long-term effects? The most important side effects included pain at the injection site, for 24 to 28 or perhaps 36 hours in about 80% of people. And systemic side effects like fevers, chills, and fatigue in perhaps approximately half, 29 to 59% of people. Again, these were transient. The safety data is available out now to about 2 to 3 months. That's as long as we've been able to follow these patients, this first huge cohort of people who received the vaccine and placebo. And so we know that longer term safety data will come, but at this point, again, we have data out to 2 or 3 months, and really most of the side effects are showing up in those first 24 hours or so, mostly pain at the injection site and some systemic side effects. And so final comment. Thank you. I perhaps speak on behalf of all of the hospital-based physicians, the ER physicians with whom I know you work incredibly closely, shoulder to shoulder with, day after day, but also the physicians who are taking care of the patients who you have brought in who've had COVID, but also the ones who you've bravely cared for in the field and brought in so that we could continue to care for them even when they didn't have COVID. I hope that this information has been helpful as you make your own decision with regards to this vaccine. I will tell you that I am so pleased to say that I was able to receive one recently. And as I've said before, I'm just grateful to have this safety belt on a little bit tighter as we enter this surge in our own community. And so just one final huge gratitude to all of you. Thank you.